It begins with a quiet sky, an empty canvas of pale morning light stretched over the Eastern Front in 1944. Far below, the forests lie, still, undisturbed, unaware of the violence that has carved this land for 3 bitter years. And yet, even in that brief silence, every pilot knew how quickly calm could turn to death. The Luftwaffe still roamed the air, hardened by countless battles. Their leaders believed that no Soviet fighter could match their experience, their machines, their tactics. But something was changing. Rumors had begun to spread among German pilots returning from the front. Stories spoken in low tones in briefing rooms and mess halls. Stories of a new Soviet fighter, small, fast, and impossibly maneuverable one, that seemed to cling to the sky like an extension of the pilot himself. They spoke of its sharp turn, its sudden climb, its ability to appear on a German pilot's tail before he could even finish a defensive roll. And behind the controls, they whispered, was a man whose name few knew, but whose presence they felt the moment engines roared to life. His name was Arseny Vorozheikin, a quiet, disciplined airman who had survived the brutal opening years of the war and risen from mechanic to squadron commander. His skill was not born from legend, nor from wartime myth, but from hard training, sharp instincts, and an unbroken will to survive. He never sought fame, never announced his victories, and rarely spoke of combat. And yet, by 1944, he had become one of the most feared pilots on the front. To understand how he achieved that, how a single pilot turned the Yak-3 into the very machine that unsettled German airmen, we must travel back to the early years of the conflict, when the Soviet Union struggled to hold the skies. In the summer of 1941, the Luftwaffe dominated the air war with frightening skill. Pilots flying the Bf-109 cut through Soviet formations with precision gained in Spain, Poland, and France. Many Soviet fighters, outdated and slow, were destroyed before their pilots even understood what had struck them. In those desperate months, men like Vorozheikin learned the harshest lessons aviation could teach: how to stay alive where others did not. But the Soviet aircraft industry was changing as quickly as the front itself. Among the design bureaus, one name began to stand out: Alexander Yakovlev. His early fighters were light, compact, and simple to maintain in the field. But by 1943, Yakovlev wanted to build something more: a fighter that could match the Luftwaffe not in weight or firepower alone, but in the very qualities that a pilot felt in his hands and in his seat. The result would be the Yak-3. Tested in 1943 and introduced to frontline regiments the following summer, the Yak-3 was unlike anything the Soviet Air Force had flown before. Its wooden wings and light airframe reduced weight to a minimum. Its VK-105 engine gave it fierce acceleration at low and medium altitude, the very heights where most Eastern Front battles were fought. It could outclimb the Bf-109G at certain ranges and turn inside the FW-190 in a tight circle fight. Luftwaffe pilots who faced it described it in their reports as dangerous, agile, and unsettling. But an aircraft, no matter how advanced, was only as deadly as the man guiding it. Vorozheikin first encountered the Yak-3 in 1944, when selected regiments received the new machine. By then, he had already proven himself in earlier Yak fighters, earning respect for precise shooting and calm judgment under fire. His commanders trusted him. His squadron looked to him, and when he first sat in the cockpit of the Yak-3, he immediately understood what Yakovlev had created. The fighter responded instantly to every movement. The controls felt almost weightless, allowing the pilot to tighten a turn with a precision that few German fighters could match. Its visibility was excellent, giving a clear view of the sky around him. And its climb, though not record-breaking, gave him the confidence to break off and reposition when needed, a luxury Soviet pilot had rarely enjoyed in 1941 or 1942. Yet the true power of the Yak-3 would not be revealed in tests or training flights. It would be proven in the sky, with danger pressing in from all sides, engines thundering, and survival hanging on a single decision made in the blink of an eye. For the Luftwaffe, the first encounters with the Yak-3 in mid-1944 were startling. Pilots noted its ability to turn suddenly, to hold altitude during sharp maneuver, and to out-accelerate heavier fighters in the crucial opening moments of combat. German reports from that period warned flight leaders to avoid entering turning battles with the new Soviet fighter. And though they did not know his name, many of these reports described the same pattern: a Yak-3 diving from above, closing rapidly, firing a short, accurate burst, and then climbing away before the German pilot could react. These were the encounters that shaped the legend. Vorozheikin flying low over contested fields and destroyed villages, learned how to use every advantage the Yak-3 offered. He fought not for fame, not for records, but because the war demanded it and because every mission meant survival for the men fighting on the ground below. What he achieved in those months would echo far beyond the battles themselves. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet advance was gaining strength across the vast stretches of Belarus and Ukraine. Airfields once smothered in dust and wreckage now hosted regiments equipped with newer machines, fresh fighters with clean lines and engines tuned for the battles ahead. The Yak-3 was among them, delivered in limited numbers to carefully selected units of the Red Army Air Force. These were formations with veteran pilots, men who had survived long enough to know the sky, intimately men like Arseny Vorozheikin. When Vorozheikin began flying the Yak-3, he approached it with the same discipline that had marked his earlier combat years. He studied every report from the Yakovlev Bureau, every wartime notice on performance, and the experiences of test pilots who had put the prototype through its first trials. He understood its strengths clearly: unmatched maneuverability at low and medium altitudes, light controls that allowed swift reaction, and excellent acceleration in combat conditions. He also knew its weaknesses: limited armament compared to some German fighters, reduced range, and a structure that had to be handled carefully in steep dives. But in the hands of a pilot who recognized its limitations and understood its design, the Yak-3 could become a formidable weapon. Vorozheikin soon gained a reputation in his regiment for using the aircraft with uncommon precision. His approach to air combat was shaped not by bravado but by wartime experience. He preferred short engagements, quick attacks, and clean withdrawals tactics that matched the Yak-3's characteristics and took advantage of its strengths. His method was simple: strike fast, avoid prolonged climbs with heavier German machines, and never allow the enemy to extend the fight into higher altitudes where German engines performed better. Luftwaffe reports from mid-1944 reveal the effect such tactics had on German pilots. Several accounts describe Yak-3 fighters emerging suddenly from cloud cover or low-level haze, using the same speed and maneuverability that Vorozheikin had mastered. These reports urged German flight leaders to retain altitude whenever possible, and to avoid entering turning fights below 3,000 meters. The Yak-3, they noted, held too much advantage there. In one documented engagement near Lublin, in July 1944, Soviet pilots flying Yak-3s confronted a formation of Bf 109 seconds returning from a ground attack mission. The German formation attempted to climb and escape into cloud cover, but the Yak-3s gained rapidly. The German accounts from that day remark on the suddenness with which the Soviet fighters closed distance, leaving little time for the Bf 109 seconds to reposition. It was the kind of encounter that became increasingly common. German pilots accustomed to dictating the terms of combat were now forced into defensive maneuvers. Vorozheikin's experience in these battles followed a similar pattern. He recorded several engagements where he used the Yak-3's acceleration to close rapidly, fire a controlled burst, and then climb out before the enemy could respond. His gunnery, honed during earlier years in the Yak-1 and Yak-7, proved particularly effective in the Yak-3's stable firing platform. He understood the value of short bursts rather than long streams, preserving ammunition and reducing stress on the aircraft's armament. But Vorozheikin's skill was not limited to technical mastery. He possessed a calm presence in the cockpit that many of his comrades later remembered. Even in the chaos of combat engines roaring, tracers cutting through the sky, he remained composed. That steadiness allowed him to judge angles quickly, assess the enemy's position, and decide whether to press or withdraw. His decisions were rarely impulsive. They reflected an instinct formed through years of combat. The Yak-3, though simple in construction, demanded respect. Its wooden wings and lightweight structure meant that steep, prolonged dives or high-speed descents could overstress the airframe. Pilots trained to avoid such conditions. Vorozheikin followed these guidelines carefully, never pushing the aircraft beyond what it was designed to handle. This respect for the machine ensured that he maintained full control even under the intense strain of combat. Among Soviet pilots, the Yak-3's arrival brought renewed confidence. Wartime memoirs describe the morale boost it gave to entire regiments. Pilots who had once fought desperately to keep pace with German fighters now found themselves with an aircraft that could outmaneuver the enemy in the very altitudes where most Eastern Front combat took place. Yak-3 became a symbol of growing Soviet strength, a sign that the Red Army's air arm had matured, learned, and adapted. Interesting historical documents from the Yakovlev Bureau mention Luftwaffe prisoner of war commenting on the Yak-3 after seeing it on captured Soviet airfields. Some expressed surprise at its size, noting that its compact frame suggested little threat. Yet, these same prisoners acknowledged the difficulty their units faced when engaging Yak-3 fighters, especially in turning battles. Their officers had warned them repeatedly, avoid low-altitude turning contests with Soviet fighters, particularly the new Yak models. Vorozhekin's reputation grew during this period not through propaganda, but through quiet acknowledgement from fellow pilots and commanders. His wartime record was built carefully, each victory confirmed according to Soviet Air Force procedure. His success was not the product of bold public claims, but of steady performance across dozens of missions. As 1944 progressed, the Yak-3's effectiveness helped Soviet forces achieve aerial superiority in several sectors of the front. German units, already strained by losses and reduced fuel supplies, found it increasingly difficult to counter the new Soviet fighter. The fear it inspired among Luftwaffe pilots was not rooted in myth but in experience. The Yak-3 had proven itself in battle, and pilots like Vorozhekin had shown how devastating it could be when used with skill. Yet the war was far from over. New dangers awaited new battles that would push pilots to their limits. Vorozhekin knew that every flight carried the weight of risk, and every engagement demanded absolute focus. He also understood that his aircraft, for all its strengths, could not protect him from every danger. Ahead lay the final chapters of the conflict, where the Yak-3 would be tested in the fiercest battles of the Eastern Front, and where Vorozhekin's skill would face its greatest trials. The final year of the war pushed every pilot, every aircraft, and every regiment to the limits of endurance. The Soviet advance had carried the front ever westward, toward the Vistula, then across Poland, and finally toward the borders of East Prussia. Each new airfield brought new dangers. Weather shifted without warning. Ground forces stretched supply lines to breaking. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, remained capable of sudden, violent resistance. For pilots like Arseny Vorozhekin, the winter of 1944 and the campaign of early 1945 were among the most intense periods of the war. His regiment flew frequent sorties escorting ground attack aircraft, intercepting enemy formations, and providing cover for advancing Soviet forces. The sky was no longer dominated by the vast numbers of German fighters once seen in earlier years, but those who remained were experienced survivors. Many belonged to hardened units transferred from other fronts. They flew Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds with deliberate skill, aware that every encounter might be their last. It was in these conditions that the Yak-3 proved its worth with unyielding clarity. Its light frame, sharp controls, and strong engine response allowed Soviet pilots to seize the initiative. In the first moments of combat, moments that often decided whether the engagement ended in victory or loss, Vorozhekin understood this better than most. He flew with a sense of measured urgency, conscious that the window for action was narrow, and that any delay could shift advantage to the enemy. One of the most documented Yak-3 engagements involving his regiment occurred during the Soviet push into East Prussia in early 1945. German fighters attempted to break through Soviet air cover to strike at ground forces on the move. The Soviet formations intercepted them just as they approached the front lines. Reports from that day describe a fierce contest at low altitude, where the Yak-3's maneuverability allowed Soviet pilots to counter the heavier German fighters with tight turns and rapid climbs. Vorozhekin's own report from this period reflects the nature of the fighting: sudden appearances of enemy formation, quick decisions, and the constant threat of hidden aircraft emerging from cloud cover or sun glare. He recorded several occasions where German pilots used steep dives to escape, relying on their aircraft's strong performance at higher speeds. But even in those cases, the Yak-3's ability to regain altitude quickly allowed Soviet pilots to re-engage or maintain control of the airspace. These final battles revealed something essential about the Yak-3's legacy. It was not a machine built for long patrols or high-altitude combat. It was designed for the Eastern Front, for the close, violent, unpredictable fights that unfolded over fields, forests, and towns. In these environments, it offered pilots a rare combination of confidence and control. Memoirs from veterans often describe the feeling of unity between man and machine, as if the aircraft responded directly to instinct. For Vorozhekin, that unity shaped every mission. His wartime record continued to grow, but he carried it without boasting. The responsibility weighed on him. He had seen comrades fall in earlier years, men whose skill had equaled his own, whose fortunes had shifted in a single moment. He flew with the awareness that survival depended on discipline, caution, and respect for the aircraft's limits. As Soviet forces approached the heart of German territory, the Luftwaffe's ability to resist diminished sharply. Fuel shortages forced many enemy units to restrict flights. Maintenance grew difficult as supply lines collapsed. Experienced pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. Though isolated German formations continued to fight with determination, the scale of their operations was drastically smaller than in years past. In this environment, the Yak-3 played a significant role in maintaining Soviet control of the air. The aircraft's agility made it ideal for clearing the skies of small, scattered enemy formations. Its ability to climb and turn quickly allowed Soviet pilots to intercept aircraft attempting to strike at advancing ground troops. And its relative simplicity meant that field mechanics could keep it operational, despite the demands of constant movement across newly captured territory. As the war moved into its final months, Vorozheikin's regiment continued to fly daily missions. He took part in the last major aerial operations on the Eastern Front, supporting Soviet forces as they closed in on key targets. His experience, judgment, and steady presence in the cockpit made him one of the regiment's most reliable pilots. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Yak-3 had already earned its reputation not through legend or rumor, but through combat. German pilots who examined captured examples after the war noted its lightweight and compact frame with a measure of respect. Some recorded that they understood, in retrospect, why their units had been urged to avoid low-altitude turning fights with Soviet fighters late in the war. The Yak-3 had been a difficult opponent, particularly in the hands of seasoned pilots. For Vorozheikin, the end of the war brought recognition of his service, but he remained the same quiet, disciplined airman he had been before the conflict. His achievements were recorded carefully, as wartime procedures required. His victories reflected not only personal skill, but the evolution of Soviet aviation from the desperate months of 1941 to the strength achieved by 1945. The story of the Yak-3 and the pilots who mastered it captures the arc of that transformation. It is a story of adaptation, perseverance, and relentless learning under the harshest conditions. It reveals how a modest, lightweight fighter, built from wood and labor, could challenge and even surpass some of the most advanced aircraft of its time. And it shows how the skill of a single pilot could turn a capable machine into a feared presence in the sky. As the final chapter closes, the legacy endures, a small fighter that held its own against formidable opponents, and a pilot whose steady hand helped shape its legend. The Yak-3 remains remembered not for overwhelming power, but for the clarity of its design and the courage of the men who flew it, and for the simple truth borne out in countless reports. In the right hands, it could change the course of a battle.